Shalom and welcome to the Ministry of Yeshua. I'm glad that you're here to learn with us. Today we're diving into this week's portion, which is called Mishpatim. We'll explore its wisdom, its beauty, and we'll see how it speaks to our lives right now. Together we'll look at passages from Exodus 21:1 through 24:18, which will connect us to 2 Kings 11:21 through 12:16, as well as Matthew 17:22 through 27. We'll start with the summary for this portion, and there are more than 10 commandments in the Torah, which we already talked about. This Torah portion actually contains more than 50 of the Torah's total 613 commandments. Immediately after speaking the 10 commandments from Mount Sinai, God gave Moses a series of laws called Mishpatim, judgments, which form the foundations and case precedents for the practice of the Torah law. These include the laws of the Hebrew slave, general laws relating to slavery, penalties for injury, murder, kidnapping, assault, and theft, tort laws for payment of damages, laws regarding financial transactions and lending, and the responsibility of a guardian charged with the care of someone else's property. The Torah portion also includes laws that warn against mistreating the stranger, laws relating to the observance of the festivals, agricultural laws, and laws about tithes. Herein we also find the prohibition on cooking a kid in its mother's milk, and many others. Moses writes the commandments into a book of the covenant, a sort of early draft of the Torah. He invites Israel to enter into a covenant with God. He builds an altar, sets up memorial pillars, and sacrifices burnt offering and peace offerings. He reads the book of covenant to the people, and they all consent to take on its terms, saying, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." He splashes half of the blood of the sacrifices onto the altar and half onto the Israelites, proclaiming, "Behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Moses ascends Mount Sinai with Aaron and his sons, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, where they share covenant meal in the very presence of God. Moses ascends higher into the fire and cloud upon the mountain. Let's go a little bit deeper. What is Mishpatim? The 18th reading from the Torah is named Mishpatim, which means judgments. The title comes from the first words of the first verse of the reading, which could be literally translated to say, "And these are the judgments which you will place before them." Exodus 21:1. The first 3 chapters of this Torah portion deliver a legal code of laws and commandments that form a nucleus for the Torah's laws. The last chapter tells the story of how the people of Israel consented to keep these laws and entered into a covenant relationship with God through a series of rituals conducted by Moses. Let's talk about grace versus law, which is something that's very important. And it comes from, "Not these are the ordinances which you are to set before them," Exodus 21:1. The Torah contains a lot of laws and commandments. When we talk about the law, we ordinarily think of lists of rules and do's and don'ts. We forget that the Torah also contains all the stories from creation through the days of Moses. Torah is much more than just a legal code. Nevertheless, it does contain many laws and commandments. The word Torah means instruction. The laws and the commandments found in the Torah are God's instructions for how He wants His people to live. Somewhat a manual. The Torah is like a user's manual for a life. This Torah portion contains a lot of laws. Exodus 21:22-23 reads like an ancient legal code. Of the 613 commandments that the sages traditionally derive from the Torah, more than 50 of them are found in this portion. For some reason, many Christian teachers seem to view the laws of the Torah as if they are a bad thing. It is commonly taught that the law is the opposite of grace. You might hear someone say, "We are no longer under the law, we are under grace." The implication is that anyone who believes in Jesus need not be concerned with the laws in the Old Testament. We can call this idea grace versus law. Let's think about the grace versus law idea. What do we mean when we say that we are not under the law? Does that mean we do not have to keep the God's rules? For example, does it mean that we can commit adultery and theft? Of course not. No one would say that. So what does it really mean? The grace versus law concept is derived from the writings of Paul, Shaul. In his epistles, it seems that Paul puts the two in opposition to each other. He often says things like, before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, Galatians 3:23. And if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law, Galatians 5:18. One might misunderstand these statements, and actually most people do, to mean that Christians do not need to keep God's rules. Of course, that would be absurd. Paul realized that some people might misunderstand his teaching, and he cautioned us not to suppose that grace gives us free license to sin against God. And it says this, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? May it never be. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? Romans 6:1-2. Do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law, Romans 3:31, and that's a very, very good scripture that contradicts that. If Paul was not teaching believers that they did not have to keep God's rules, what was he talking about? In Paul's day, many of the Jewish believers taught that before Gentiles could enter the kingdom of heaven, they needed to become Jewish. The idea that a Gentile must become Jewish before being saved is what Paul calls being under the law. As we have seen earlier in our studies, Paul believed that Gentiles became sons of Abraham and part of the people of God through faith in Messiah. They did not need to earn that status by becoming legally Jewish. They did not need to first come under the law in order to enter the kingdom. The Bible does not actually teach the idea of grace versus law. Grace is God's free gift of salvation to those who believe in His Son. Law is His love and instruction for how His people should live. Grace versus law is a false dichotomy. They are not opposed to each other. They are meant to work hand in hand, actually. This can be compared to a man who adopted a son. After he had brought the boy home, he told him, in our house, we have certain rules. One of them is that you must always clear your dishes from the table after eating. The boy began to fret. He reasoned to himself, if I do not clear the dishes from the table, I will no longer be adopted. I will be an orphan again. Foolish child. The rules of the house were not meant to earn his place in the family. His obligation to the rules resulted from his already being made a part of the family. So things get backward if we start to believe that we must keep God's law in order to be saved. Instead, we should keep God's law because we are saved. And that was the main message that Paul was teaching people. Let's take a look at the different types of laws. So now these are the ordinances which you are to set before them, Exodus 21:1. The Torah contains different types of laws. There are 4 main Hebrew words used to describe the type of laws we find in the Bible. It is possible to make a distinction between one type and another, but the words are often used interchangeably. They seem to have a broad range of meanings that tend to overlap with one another. So, for example, commandment would be a mitzvah, and in plural, it would be mitzvot. Judgment or ordinance is mishpat. In plural, mishpatim. Statute is called a hukah, hok. In plural, it would be hukot or hukim. And the law, which is instruction, is called the Torah. And in plural would be torot. So mitzvah is a broadest Hebrew word for a commandment, which is the word mitzvah. It comes from a Hebrew root tzavah, which means to command. It can be used to refer to any mandate that God gives. In common usage, it is often rendered as a good deed. For example, when Yeshua says, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven, that's in Matthew 5:16, he is most likely using the term good work as an idiomatic reference to the mitzvah. Mishpat. The Hebrew word mishpat is translated by the NASB as ordinance, but it would be better translated as judgment, actually. The root word is shafat, which means to judge. In Hebrew, a judge is called a shofet. The name of this Torah portion is the plural version of the word mishpat, mishpatim. Mishpatim are best understood as legal judgments that might have been issued by a court of law. They may be seen as civil laws and case precedents. Chok. The Hebrew word chok can appear in both masculine and feminine forms, chok and chukah, respectively. According to the traditional interpretation, it refers to a commandment that has no rational explanation. For example, the commandment not to murder is a reasonable and rational commandment that makes good sense. The logic behind the commandment not to wear a garment made of wool and linen is more obscure. That obscurity puts it into the category of chok. A chok does not need to make sense to us. It is simply a mandate of the Almighty. And last one is the Torah. The word Torah means an instruction. It can be translated as law, instruction, or teaching. It might refer to a single law, a certain category of laws, or the entire 5 books of Moses. So by whatever name we call them, the commandments of God are all His wise and loving instruction for His people. They are the fundaments of Judaism, and such they are the fundamentals of biblical faith and revelation. This Torah portion contains far too many laws for a detailed study of all of them, so instead we will look at several specific ones. Slavery in the Bible. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. Exodus 21:2. Some of the most difficult laws to grapple with are the laws of slavery. In North America, our collective memory of slavery is ugly. People were kidnapped, maltreated, bought and sold, subjugated to all sorts of cruelties, and denied basic human dignities. It seems that by offering laws regarding slavery, the Bible is condoning it. Whenever we see the Bible, we need to remember issues of the context. 2 important matters of the context must be considered in regard to the Bible's laws about slavery. First, we must remember that the Israelites had just left slavery. They had experienced it in its ugliest form. It is only natural that God would address that institution and lay out rules to prevent the perpetuation of the maltreatment of slaves. All of the Bible's laws about slaves are meant for the protection and well-being of the people enslaved. God did not want the Israelites to treat their servants the way they themselves had been treated. This can be compared to an abusive home in which a son is beaten by his father. When the boy grows up, he beats his own children because that is the manner of parenting he learned from his father. The Bible's laws of slavery are meant to break that pattern of the mistreatment of the other human beings. The second point of the context is the realization that slavery in the ancient world was a real and normal part of the economy. In those days, there was no standard of currency. The people did not ordinarily work jobs as we do right now. People lived primarily off the land. This meant that if you were not a landowner or independently wealthy with your own flocks and herds, you probably had no secure means of supporting yourself and your family. The concept of work for hire was risky, short-term, and had no guarantees. There were no labor laws, minimum wage requirements, or retirement plans. For the landless lower class, servitude was an attractive option. It offered the equation of meaningful skills, lifelong employment, and food and shelter for a person and his dependents. In most societies, slaves had no rights. The Torah changes that. According to the laws in this Torah portion, slaves were to be treated as servants for hire rather than property. And after 6 years of service, they were to be given the option of going free. The Bible laws of slavery were designed to prevent the type of enslavement experienced by many Black Americans in North America prior to the Civil War. In the Torah, kidnappers face the death penalty. If a slave is beaten and maimed, he is to be immediately released. If a slave is killed by his owner, the man faces the death penalty. One might say that since slavery has been abolished, the Bible's laws of slavery are irrelevant to the modern world. That is not the case. If we remember that slaves in the biblical period were roughly equivalent to the employees in today's economy, we can learn several things about God's heart. The Torah would have us treat employees fairly, with dignity and worthy compensation. There is a beautiful hint in the text that is perhaps a key to understanding the Bible's intention regarding slavery. In Exodus 21:1 through 11, the laws about slaves, the Hebrew word for go out, it's yatzah, appears 7 times. 7 is the number of divinity. In rescuing Israel from slavery, God indicated his will for human beings to be free. He desired for slaves to be able to go out from servitude. The theme of freeing one's servant is repeated in these passages. This set of instructions immediately follows the story of the exodus from Egyptian slavery that culminated with the giving of the covenant to this new nation of ex-slaves. The people of Israel carried on their bodies and souls the inedible marks of their former brutal and harsh slavery. In the book of Corinthians, for example, Paul gives advice to believers who were slaves. He tells them that if they can obtain their freedom, they should do so, because now they belong to Messiah. And it says this, "Were you called while you were a slave? Do not worry about it. If you are able also to become free, rather do that. For he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become a slave of man." 1 Corinthians 7:21 through 23. So the laws of freeing one's slaves are an appropriate introduction to the laws that follow. The people of Israel are free men now, and their relationship with the law should be one of voluntary compliance, not forced compulsion. I will not go out. But if the slave plainly says, "I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as free man," Exodus 21:5. How could we understand what it is to serve the master of masters if we did not know what godly slavery looks like? The Bible gives us an important insight into biblical slavery with the law of the slave who does not want to be released. Exodus 21:2 tells us that a slave must be set free after 6 years of servitude. However, if at the end of 6 years the slave declares that he does not want to go free but prefers to stay with his master, he is allowed to remain as permanent part of his owner's household. If his owner lived according to the godly standards of the Torah and treated his slaves by those standards, it was possible that a slave would not want his freedom. This law demonstrates how different the Torah's version of slavery is. It also gives us an insight into our own spiritual situation. Just as the Israelites were born into slavery in Egypt, we were all born as slaves to sin. Sin and the authority of Satan was our spiritual Egypt. Our liberation came to us much like it came to Israelites. It came as a miraculous gift of grace, deliverance, and redemption by the mighty hand of a loving and merciful God, through the agency of a great Redeemer. However, our freedom from sin is not freedom to sin. Instead, we have now become slaves of God, but with a price. We legally belong to Him. Just as the Torah version of slavery is different from that of the Egyptians, so too is our servitude to the Heavenly Father different from our enslavement to the adversary. When we come to know God, we desire to serve Him voluntarily. We do not want to leave His household. And we'll talk about women and female slaves. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. Exodus 21:10. The Bible gives special attention to the protection of female slaves. The Torah regulations for female slaves safeguard the personal rights and protect her from sexual exploitation. Moreover, the character of her servitude was different than that of a male slave. The Torah does not even refer to her as a slave, which is eved in Hebrew. It uses a different word altogether, amah, and the NASB translates amah as female slave, but it might be better translated as maidservant. One might suppose that an amah was something akin to a domestic servant. The Torah protects female slave from sexual exploitation. If her master desired her or wanted to give her to his son, he could take her only by marrying her or having his son marry her, and according her the rights of a wife. In the narrative of Genesis, we read of several female slaves who were elevated to marital status. Hagar and Keturah became Abraham's concubines. And many of you guys who don't know, Hagar and Keturah is the same person. Bilhah and Zilpah, the servants of Rachel and Leah, became the wives of Jacob. While discussing the man who marries his maidservant, the Torah mentions the husband's minimum obligations toward a wife. The Bible says that he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. Exodus 21:10. At minimum, every husband must provide for his wife's physical needs. It is a commandment of the Bible to provide our wives with food, clothing, and intimacy. Murderers, kidnappers, and bad kids. He who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Exodus 21:17. There are 5 transgressions listed in Exodus 21:12 through 17 for which the punishment is death at the hands of a court of law. The first 3 are relatively straightforward: criminal homicide, premeditated murder, and kidnapping. Exodus 21:12 speaks about criminal homicide, intentionally striking someone and killing that person. This law is reiterated in Leviticus 24:17 and 21. Exodus 21:14 says that anyone who commits an act of premeditated murder is liable for death penalty. The crime of kidnapping also receives the death penalty. Exodus 21:16 says that he who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. In the ancient world, just as in the days of the African slave trade, kidnapping was conducted primarily for the purposes of feeding the slave market. The Bible regards this crime as punishable by death, because just as with a murder, a man's life is stolen. For the other 2 sins in this passage for which the Torah prescribes death, it is harder to see how the punishment fits the crime. The Torah deems striking or cursing one's parents as such a grave sin that it is worthy of death. This may seem shocking to us. There is no indication that the parent was killed or even badly hurt in the altercation with the child. The mere act of hitting one's father or mother is enough impotence that God deems it as bad as murder. This shows us how God's values are sometimes different from ours. Of course, we would never advocate striking one's father or mother, but neither would we feel comfortable putting someone to death for doing so. Family counseling, yes. Anger management classes, sure. Death by stoning? Probably not. God sees it differently. When He says, honor your father and your mother, in Exodus 20:12, He means it. Similarly, Exodus 21:17 says, he who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. So what does it mean to curse one's parents? Yeshua referenced this commandment as part of honoring father and mother. It says this, for Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who speaks evil of father or mother is to be put to death. Mark 7:10. So according to traditional Judaism, the passage is not speaking of simply abusive language. It is speaking of a real curse. If a son or daughter uses the holy name of the Lord to utter an intentional curse against one of their parents, that son or daughter is worthy of death. Sometimes people point to laws like these as evidence that the commandments of Torah are irrelevant. What are you going to do? Start stoning people? They might ask. Even though all of these sins are punishable by death, according to the Bible, the death sentence can be carried out only by a Torah court of law that has civil jurisdiction. What is more, Jewish tradition relegates that authority only within the borders of political Israel. So without a Torah practicing government, like the administration of the kings of Judah, and without a Torah court of law like the Sanhedrin in the land of Israel, the death penalties are suspended. In fact, none of the strict measures of the Torah justice, stoning, and the like are applicable unless one is in the land of Israel under the authority of a duly ordained Torah court of law. Since there has not been a functional Sanhedrin wielding civil authority in almost 2,000 years, there has not been a capital case tried in just as long. Just because the punishment cannot be enforced, however, does not mean that the law is of the books. We should still remember that each one of these sins carries the same grievous weight. In God's book, it is just as much of a sin to curse one's parents or to strike them as it is to murder someone. The extreme punishment for striking or cursing one's parents teaches the importance that biblical religion places on the integrity and decency of the family. Rebellion, violence, and insolence against one's parents, whether physical or verbal, is as much a threat to the fabric of society as murder and kidnapping. In today's world, society teaches children, particularly teenagers, to disrespect their parents. It is normal to hear teenagers speak to their parents with impertinent and insolent words. It is embarrassing to be around a family where the children are out of order. Children who are disrespectfully speak back to their parents are a public disgrace to the family. As a society, we have lost the biblical value of honoring father and mother. The Apostle Paul warned that in the last days, a spirit of rebelliousness would be unleashed upon the world. He said that man will be arrogant, revelers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable. That's 2 Timothy 3:2-3. He advised us to avoid such men as these, 2 Timothy 3:5. Paul's recommendation is good child-rearing advice. If you don't want your child to grow up to be disrespectful and mouthy toward you, don't have him socialize with other children who are disrespectful to their parents. It's a serious matter. If you knew that your son's peers were murderers and kidnappers, you would not allow him to be under their influence for even a moment. According to the Bible, children who scorn their parents are just as bad. Restitution and compensation. If there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as penalty life for life, Exodus 21:23. Much of the Torah's legislation, especially when it comes to restitution and court-imposed penalties, is based on a justice system called measure for measure. This ancient code of justice is spoken of in theological circles as lex talionis, which is a Latin for law of retaliation. It is the principle of exact equivalence. On the surface, it seems simple and barbaric. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise, Exodus 21:23-25. The law of eye for eye is usually understood to mean that identical physical injury should be inflicted in retaliation for a physical injury suffered. This is the sort of thing that gives the Old Testament a bad name. After all, didn't Yeshua refute this harsh law of retaliation with the laws of love? Consider the following passage from Matthew. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go on a mile, go with him too. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Matthew 5:38 through 42. Yeshua was speaking about resting the urge to take personal revenge. He was not setting aside the law of measure for measure. Instead, he was correcting its interpretation. If someone poked you in the eye, you might quote Exodus 21:24, saying eye for an eye, and poke the other person in his eye. But that's not what Exodus 21:24 is about. It is not a license for personal vengeance or settling the score. The law of measure for measure is a rule for how a court of law should assign damages and restitution. Yeshua did not want his disciples misusing the passage to justify their own personal vendettas, but he was not suggesting that a court of law should drop the standard of measure for measure. It would be unjust for the court of law to set aside the law of measure for measure. For example, imagine that your neighbor burned your house down. You took him to court to sue him for damages. The judge said to you, "My verdict is that I forgive the man." You would be outraged. What right does the judge have to forgive the man? If anyone is going to forgive the man, it would be you, not the judge. So when Yeshua taught his disciple to turn the other cheek, he was telling them how to forgive others, not how to adjudicate in a court of law. The law of measure for measure is about monetary, not physical compensation. This is clearly seen in Exodus 21:22, the law that introduced the measure for measure list, which says, "He shall surely be fined." Similarly, Exodus 21:19 speaks of a case where perpetrator must pay for his victim's conveyances and associated expenses. He shall only pay for his loss of time and shall take care of him until he is completely healed. Exodus 21:19. Now, Rashi explains the eye for eye concept as financial remuneration. In his comments on Exodus 21:24, he explains, if a man blinded another man's eye, he must pay the man the value of his eye. So too with all the other damages. Laws of oxen. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be surely stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall go unpunished. Exodus 21:28. Why does the Torah give so many laws about oxen? Are these laws relevant to us if we do not own an ox? The Apostle Paul explains, God is not concerned about oxen, is he? Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yes, for our sake it was written. 1 Corinthians 9:9 through 10. In other words, the laws of oxen are given as examples from which we are to derive broader principles and applications. In Exodus 21, the Torah gives us several laws about oxen to illustrate principles of responsibility and liability. A man who owns a dangerous animal is responsible for damages caused by that animal. Similarly, a man who damages someone else's property or animal is responsible to compensate for the damage. Likewise, a man who digs a pit into which someone's animal falls is liable for restitution. All of these laws drive home the concept of personal responsibility and concern for others. The Torah is teaching us that we do not live in isolation. When our negligence hurts others, we are responsible to correct the wrong. The concept sounds simple enough, but it has implications for almost every area of our life. Theft. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. Exodus 22:1. We all know that stealing is wrong. But what is to be done to right the wrong? The Torah mandates that a thief must pay double to his neighbor for the value of what he has stolen. In the case of livestock, if he cannot return the original animals, he must pay 4 or 5 times the value back to the owner. The Torah's math works out to ensure that the crime does not pay. The Apostle Paul says this, "He who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with the one who has need." Ephesians 4:28. Talk about the neighbor stuff. If a man borrows anything from his neighbor and it is injured or dies while its owner is not with it, he shall make a full restitution. Exodus 22:14. Several of the laws of Exodus 22 are concerned with situations in which a man is entrusted with another's property. Consideration are made for whether the person was renting, borrowing, or entrusted as a guardian. The laws are complex and require careful investigation. In general, they reinforce the principles of responsibility, liability, and compensation. And now we'll talk about sex outside of marriage. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. Exodus 22:16. In today's world, it is considered normal for a man and woman to have sexual relations outside of wedlock, which is really sad, and God disagrees with it. A man who has sexual relations with a betrothed woman or a married woman is an adulterer and is liable to death penalty. But suppose the woman is not married or spoken for. The Torah insists that a man who has sexual relations with an unmarried girl is obligated to marry her. He must pay the father a bride price of at least 50 shekels, and he is not allowed to ever divorce her. The father of the girl may refuse to allow the marriage, but he may still demand the bride price for his daughter. In God's view, sex is sacred and is sanctioned only within the confines of marriage. These laws reveal another aspect of biblical worldview. According to the Torah, the father of the girl has the right to refuse to give his daughter in marriage. Before marrying a woman, a man must receive the approval and blessing of her father. Safeguards for true worship. He who sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be utterly destroyed. Exodus 22:20. The Torah offers 3 injunctions designed to protect God's people from entering into idolatry and the paganism of the time. Exodus 22:18 forbids the people from tolerating a sorcerer. A sorcerer or a sorceress was one who used magic, spellcrafts, or other occult arts. The sorcerer was to be put to death. For this reason, we need to be careful to avoid occultism. The Didache, a compendium of instructions to Gentile believers composed sometime in the late 1st century or early 2nd century, states that occultism is a form of idolatry. And it says this: "Thou shalt not practice magic, thou shalt not practice witchcraft. My child, be not an observer of omens, since it leads to the way of idolatry. Neither an incanter, nor an astrologer, nor a purifier, nor be willing to look at these things, for out of all these idolatry is engendered." And you can find that in Didache 2:2 and 3:4. People of faith should have nothing to do with mediums, fortune tellers, horoscopes, or witchcraft. Our only contact with the supernatural should be through God. And, like many people always warn us against occult entertainments and games like Ouija boards and seances. Many parents knew enough about the spiritual world to take it seriously. In Exodus 22:19, it's a prohibition on the disgusting act of bestiality. So sexual relations with an animal, aside from the fact that it's contrary to the natural order of creation, bestiality had associations with pagan religious practices. A similar prohibition in Leviticus 18:23 and 20:15 through 16 occurs in the context of avoiding the pagan practices of the Canaanites. A person who commits an act of bestiality was liable to the death penalty. Exodus 22:20 specifically warns against sacrificing to any other god besides the Lord. The prohibition on bestiality is placed between the prohibitions on sorcery and idolatry, and that's to teach us that one who worships demons rather than God is like a person who has relations with an animal rather than with his spouse. Strangers. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Exodus 22:21. God wants us to be concerned for the disadvantaged, disenfranchised, and vulnerable members of the society. The Lord shows special concern for 4 social groups that are especially susceptible to exploitation. It's the stranger, the widow, the orphan, and the poor. It seems to be a natural human response to shun strangers. People who are different from us frighten us. They make us feel uncomfortable. Society naturally isolates those from different backgrounds. The stranger is any person residing among us who has left his former residence and native social context. He no longer has the local community from whom he can receive sustenance, encouragement, counsel, and care. There are many biblical prohibitions against the mistreatment of strangers. The command to care for strangers is among the most often repeated commandments in the Bible. Not even the commandment to love God, keep the Sabbath, honor parents, or give charity are so underscored by the Torah. The Bible says that God loves the stranger. He shows his love for the stranger by providing him with food and clothing. Therefore, we should do likewise. And it says, God shows his love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. So show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. Deuteronomy 10:18-19. And the Apostle John wrote that we should show the love of God to disadvantaged with our deeds. It says this, but whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. 1 John 3:17-18. Furthermore, the stranger is to be welcomed into the society of the people. The Bible says that when a stranger resides among the people of God, he is to be welcomed and regarded as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. Leviticus 19:34. If strangers are shown that kind of welcome and love, they will not be strangers for long. In the Talmud, the sages understood the stranger to be a non-Jew who had undergone a conversion to Judaism. But the Torah's definition of a stranger is much more broader. In the context of any community of faith, the stranger is anyone who comes in from an outside of the community. No father or husband. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. Exodus 22:22. God has a special affection for the widow and the fatherless, and he rages against those who would exploit them. Whereas the human tendency is to take advantage of the weak and the underprivileged, disregarding the helpless, God is the father of orphans and the husband of widows. He is their defender, and he demands that we take up their cause. The Torah warns that God will repay anyone who exploits a widow or an orphan by leaving that person's wife widowed and his children orphaned. The Proverbs warns us not to exploit the fatherless because their Redeemer is strong. He will plead their case against you. And that's in Proverbs 23:11. Borrowing and lending. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. Exodus 22:25. Exodus 22:25-27 warns us not to take advantage of the poor by lending to them at interest. In fact, biblical law imposes an absolute ban on charging our spiritual brothers and sisters interest. We are to lend to one another freely, not anticipating any return on the loan except the principal amount. In Judaism, the words, if you lend money to my people, Exodus 22:25, are understood as a mandate to lend to others who are in need. Therefore, the Jewish community regards it as an obligation to make free loans to the needy in the community. A man sets aside certain amount of money that he can afford to loan out. When a needy person asks for help, the man already has some money that he can loan to the person. You might think that it would be a greater deed to simply give the man the money, but this robs the poor man of dignity and makes the money unavailable for future charitable loans. Instead, the money should be lent without interest. Then, when it is repaid, it can be loaned out again. For example, suppose you decided that you could afford to loan out $10 every week. That's not much money, but imagine that you loaned the $10 to a family in need. The next week you set aside another $10, and the needy family repaid your $10. Then you would have $20 available to loan to the next needy person to cross your path. Think of it as recycling charity. Yeshua probably had this commandment of the Torah in mind when he said, "Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you." Matthew 5:42. Love your enemies. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey wandering away, you shall surely return it to him. Exodus 23:4. In the days of the apostles, people would quote Leviticus 19:18, which says, "You shall love your neighbor." But then they would quip, "and hate your enemy." Yeshua complained about this popular distortion of the Torah. He said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.'" Matthew 5:43. That's not what the Bible said. It is a mitzvah to love your neighbor, but the Torah never says that we are to hate our enemies. Instead, the Bible instructs us to show kindness even to our enemies. The Torah teaches that if you find something your enemy lost, you are to return it to him. If you see your enemy in a trouble or difficulty, you are to help him. These are difficult laws, but they reveal the very heart of God. Proverbs 25:21 says this, "If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat, and if he is thirsty, give him water to drink." Rather than allowing people to think that it was permissible to hate their enemies, Yeshua taught us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. The Didache takes the teaching of the Master even farther when it reports an alternate version of Yeshua's saying on the matter. It says this, "Bless them that curses you, and pray for your enemies, and fast for them that persecute you. For what thank is there if you love them that love you? Do not also the Gentiles do the same? But do you love them that hate you? And you shall not have an enemy." Didache 1:3. In practical terms, the commandments to love one's enemy is one of the most difficult commandments in the entire Bible. But as the Didache states, if we love our enemies, then we will not have enemies. More laws. Now concerning everything that I have said to you, be on your guard. Exodus 23:13. We have examined only a few of the precious commandments in this Torah portion, and even to these we have not done justice. The Torah portion goes on through the end of Exodus 23 with additional laws of ethics, morality, and ritual concerns. Several of these laws recur in the later Torah portions, and they'll be discussed in greater detail in the comments on those sections. But the chapter concludes with God's promises to bring Israel into the land of Canaan, driving out the inhabitants of the land before them. However, the covenant promises were contingent upon Israel's obedience to the laws laid out in the previous chapters. Moreover, the Lord warned the Israelites to make the covenants with the people of the land, or with their gods, or to be swayed by their forms of worship. Instead, Israel was to topple the pagan religious system of Canaanites and supplant it with the worship of God. Ratification of the covenant. Then Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances. And all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which the Lord has spoken we will do." Exodus 24:3. At the foot of Mount Sinai, Moses invited Israel to enter a covenant ceremony with God. Like a wedding ceremony, the covenant at Mount Sinai was a formal affair. Moses recounted the commandments God had delivered to him. The people responded, "All the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do," Exodus 24:3. Then Moses wrote down all the words on a scroll. The commitment to writing was an important part of the ratification process of treaties in the ancient Near East. By writing it all down, Moses made the terms of covenant into a legal reality. He read the words of the scroll aloud to all the people. Again they responded, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." Exodus 24:7. The people of Israel made a covenant in the presence of all the hosts of heaven and the Lord himself to follow God's Torah. By doing so, they also committed to their progeny and the future generations of the people of Israel to do the same. Finally, as was the custom with the ratification of ancient treaties, the appropriate sacrifices were offered. After he made the sacrifices, Moses sprinkled the sacrificial blood on the people and said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you is in accordance with all these words." Exodus 24:8. The blood was split in half. One half was applied to an altar for the Lord, the other half was applied to the people. Marking both parties with the blood symbolized that shared the responsibility of keeping the covenant. God would never fail to keep his part of his treaty, but the people of Israel were destined to have problems holding up their end of the commitment. Yeshua, the deliverer and redeemer, like unto but greater than Moses, repeats this phrase, the blood of the covenant, when he ratifies God's new covenant with his people. At his last Seder meal with his disciples, he took the cup and said, "This cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." Luke 22:20. The wedding ceremony at Mount Sinai ended with a shared meal on the mountain. The Lord invited Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's sons, and the elders of the people to ascend the slopes of Mount Sinai. They brought food from the sacrifices with them. There on Mount Sinai they saw the God of Israel, and they ate and drank. Exodus 24:10-11. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If this message blessed you, please like the video and subscribe. It helps the message to reach more people who need encouragement and truth. And feel free to follow our Instagram, linked in the comments, for daily inspiration and prayers. May God bless you and keep you. May he shine his light on you and be gracious to you. May he turn toward you and grant you peace. Grace and shalom to you all.